I guess what I'm most curious about is maybe the integration between the writing life and sort of what would be a functional life, and whether or not those two are the same thing or compatible or incompatible, or how that sort of manifests in your circumstance.
Well, I think it's funny because I'm married to someone who has a very full workday as far as social interaction. Eric teaches at a school, and so he is just bombarded with interaction. And I'll spend my days by myself. So I'm either in my apartment or in a coffee shop, but with my headphones in and working on a manuscript. And so when he comes home at 5, I'm like bounding up to the door, and I'm like, and then for breakfast I had oatmeal, and then I worked on a review in the morning, and then I had lunch. It was a salad. It was good. And then I was working in the afternoon, and I went to a yoga class, and then he's just like wants a scotch and he wants to watch TV, because he is like so tired of people at that point. And so I feel like I'm a sort of Betty Friedan moment of like I'm living a life during the day that is stripped of human contact. And so I'm desperate for it at the end of the day. Like a 50s housewife without other opportunities. And Eric is the sort of, Mad Men, like just like get me to bed as soon as I can. And so I feel like writing is, in some ways, is always going to put all of us writers in a position of communing with something and expressing feelings in our work, but not doing it in the organic, actually talking to a person way. So it can put extra pressure on interactions when they happen. So when I became a more or less full-time writer, I sort of would open my calendar on Sundays and take out the phone and like make appointments. Like have lunch, have coffee, like go out for drinks. Because if I didn't, I would run the risk of spending a day or 2 days without actually talking to anyone, and that was a danger of the writing life, because we need that, even if there aren't things that you need to say or that you need to hear, you think, but the actual act of speaking and hearing is really important. And so that was a big lesson for me in my writing life. But as far as what writing can do, it's been really interesting to talk to younger readers in that level, because I remember my middle school experience, which I enter middle schools now in this like privileged position of being an adult, so I can just observe it and not feel the misery that everyone around me is feeling. But I realized middle school is this place where students, they're like space aliens. Like they're not children and they're not human beings. They're like something else, dropped all together in competition. And it's just an unhappiness machine. And so I feel when I'm talking to them about writing, I talk about my journey. Like in 7th grade, I was probably the least happy I've ever been in my life. And part of it was that I would sit down with my friends at lunch or after school, and I would say things, but they were all basically inauthentic. I was trying to figure out how to be cool or how to fit in, and so there would be like, oh yeah, like Super Mario Brothers, or like, well, so what'd you do this weekend, and like I hate bologna, but you're not actually saying anything that has like, it's not really communing. This is actually probably totally inflected by my gayness too. Like I felt like I was covering when I was in middle school too, but writing, even though I was writing fantasy, I loved sword and sorcery fantasy, so I was into like glowing blue magic and like dragons with long names and all that. Even though that was what I was writing, I was expressing something I could not get out in my everyday life. So writing was a lifeline that way, in that it allowed me to access the 80% of me that was under the surface that wasn't getting out. It was like fighting against the acceptable 20% that I was showing to my friends. And so I think writing, especially in a younger writer, can be a vent for things that are trapped inside otherwise. And there doesn't have to be one identity politic or one central issue, but just the level of thought. And if you are, say you do have a lot of like angst, and like you don't feel it's acceptable to burden your friends with your angst. If you don't express it, then it just sits there. And if you write it, then you do express it, so it's a way of releasing some of that pressure so that you can exist in the world in a more happy state. So, and I think that's totally true for younger writers. And readers too. Like if you read about a situation that gives you some sort of kinship recognition, that you find yourself in a book, it can also help in those situations. So always keep that in mind, especially with younger readers.
I'm actually really fascinated by the connection you made to the sort of pre-second wave feminist revolution housewife trope or whatever. It makes me curious to ask you about writing about female characters or writing female characters. A, is that a question you get a lot? And B, how do you answer it, or how do you think about it, or do you even think about it?
So writing female characters, I do think about it, mainly because it's something, anytime I'm writing about an identity that isn't mine, I'm really worried about getting it wrong. And even more, I'm worried about getting it right in the kind of superficial way that like confirms what everyone already believes about X or Y. So if I write, especially since I'm writing about teens, if I write about a 13-year-old girl and everyone's like, yeah, that's so 13-year-old girl, I've kind of screwed up, that like the idea is I should complicate the story, not confirm it. And so I'm aware of that when I'm writing about female characters. I actually find it much harder to write male characters in general, if they're straight. Because when I read A Room of One's Own, there was this moment where Virginia Woolf says, she's talking about Shakespeare's sister, and she says that she would know what it was to be thwarted and opposed. And I was like, thwarted and opposed, like yes, like I get it, like I know what that feels like. And so my latest book, which is coming out in May, is a straight male football player as the main character. And he doesn't really know what it's like to be thwarted and opposed in any substantial way. And so it's really been very difficult to get into the mindset of someone who doesn't get that. But as a gay man or a straight woman, I haven't written any gay women, but that to know what it's like to be thwarted and opposed is very similar. So it's actually fairly easier embodiment for me. Endangered has a female main character, and I think the main thing I was actively aware of was I wanted to prevent gendering her too much. So I didn't want to write about like her issues of 17 or like, what brand of maxi pad she would use. Not that 13-year-old girls use maxi pads that often. But so I just wanted her to be a human first, and then female in the ways that it was important for the book. So she's in Congo and she's trying to get across the country to reach her mother, who's on the other side of the country. And she's aware of a very specific kind of danger that she has as being female. And to disregard that would be dishonest. And so that aspect of her femaleness was really important for the book, and I was conscious of it as I was writing. But otherwise, if it's just her with this orphan ape hanging out, I just wrote her as Sophie. I wasn't thinking about her girlness or her femaleness. So it was this kind of code switching. Like if she was around other people, then I did have to be consciously aware of the fact that she was female. And otherwise, I was very glad to just get away from it, not really worry about it. I think for me, the thing I'm just most worried about is confirming gender expectations. I'm not particularly. I'm doing it all the time in my writing because I'm writing about society, which does it anyway. But I think finding ways to give room for kids who are of any type of identity to find themselves in a book is important. But YA literature for a long time had you could have gay characters, like in the 80s and 90s they did, but they would often be punished, not directly, but like they would finally find true love and then they would die in a car accident, or they would come out and then it would lead to like a life of drugs and like a decline. So it was this moral code kind of being instituted on it. It was a way to have gay content, because then the gateholders, the teachers or librarians that might have otherwise kept it out, said, well, it does teach a good lesson in the end, about being careful. So one thing that's been great in the last 10 years is the growth of LGBT literature for teens and even younger audiences that doesn't punish kids for being gay in sort of narrative ways, even if it's not a technical punishment, where it's just really can be joyous and positive. It's not even, doesn't have to be an angsty coming out story, that it can be joyful. It's taken a long time to get to that point. So when I was a teenager, the gay literature that I was reading, books like Last Watch of the Night by Paul Manette, which was about the AIDS crisis. And so characters just a few years older than I was were falling in love and losing their loved ones to AIDS or dying themselves. And I compare that. I spent this summer reading YA literature.
This last summer?
This summer, yeah, because I was on a jury panel, so I had to read 300 books. So I got a real sense of the breadth of what's out there and what books are happening. And there was one book, Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda, which felt so current. And the main character is, he's on the school's Tumblr account. He's created this artificial identity, and he discovers that another student has an identity up there where that student is clearly gay, and they have this online romance, but they haven't revealed their true identities to each other, and they're trying to figure out who they are. And it's kind of a mystery story of like who around me that I'm interacting with day by day is then by night my boyfriend on social media, and it just felt so. I was so glad for it, but it also felt like I was just so aware of the shift that late 80s versus 2015 had in literature and mentality and mindset, that this is the current gay story. So I was glad to see it. And I wished I'd had it when I was younger, but my world that I was in wasn't as easy as figuring out who was behind that Tumblr account either. There was a book I read for the award process that was about a transgender kid coming out at 9. So he's been assigned boy from birth, but really feels himself to be a girl. And ultimately, by the end, finds a way to sort of experience a different gender. But it was really interesting book, an important book, and one of the great things the author did is just assigns the main character, even though his name is George, assigns George she as a pronoun. So it's like really reflecting George's internal state. It was really cool, and it made me realize that with transgender, you have kids that are going to have to come out before they have sexuality. Like George isn't attracted to anyone yet, but George does know that George is a girl, even though everyone says he to him, her. And so it opened my eyes to that whole, how does a 9-year-old have the language, the equipment to come out? It opened my eyes to that difficulty or that need for awareness and openness around, kids that might be in that situation. There's also a way that language feels so constraining with pronouns that I find it often when I'm writing a scene that a figure appears on the horizon and the main character doesn't know who it is. You still end up having to say he or she or they, which is grammatically incorrect, even though the character doesn't know the gender of that person. And it was a fascinating thing with George, how easy it was and how little fanfare it needed for this main character to just be described in the third person as she, from the get-go. And then it was that like kind of like shock whenever another, like the mother or the father or the brother would say like, you know, hey boy, get over here, to a character that we're reading as she, you know. It really allowed us to enter into that disconnect that George was feeling, in a way that instead of language being an artificial lens, like it was the truest lens for it there. Like it was a genius move. I thought it was a really terrific book that way.
Cool.
And I think it'll be useful for kids to read, you know.